County. So basically, our study is to track the changes in this big area over the past 30 years. In the African American community, the changes in terms of population change, poverty change, income change, neighborhood transition, and other variables. Okay. First, let's take a look at population change. This table shows the population change over the past 30 years for the 4 major racial or ethnic groups. As you can see from this table, I mean, the different color lines represent different racial ethnic groups. As you can see, whites and Hispanics had much higher population growth rates, and the population size of African Americans have remained relatively stable, as shown on this blue line. So, as a result of this population change, by the year 2011, there were about 1 million African Americans living in the Houston metropolitan area, and the size of Hispanics were about twice the size of African Americans, and whites were still the dominant group with about 3.7 million people. So this is population. Let's take a look at how the population were distributed in this area. This map shows the distribution of African Americans in the year 1980. The different shades of color stand for a different number of people. With the deeper color means more people, and the lighter color means the opposite. As you can see, in the year 1980, African Americans were primarily concentrated. Oh, by the way, the red lines stand for the major highways, so you have a geographic reference. So these are downtown area. African Americans were primarily concentrated in the northeast downtown, the south and southeast downtown, and the southwest corner of Central City, and certain parts of the surrounding outside counties. Okay, that's 1980. Let's take a look at the 1990 map. See, 1980, 1990. See the changes in color? It means basically some light color areas becomes heavier, which means African Americans started to move. People started to move. And where did they go? 1980, 1990, 2000. I mean, the pattern is becoming clearer and clearer. Let's take a look at it again. 1980, 1990, 2000, then 2011. See? So it's pretty obvious where they went. Just now, in the year 2011, African Americans in Houston metropolitan area were primarily concentrated just along and outside the outer loop, the Beltway number 8, and spread outward in the border areas between the Harris County and the surrounding outside counties, this area. And this map summarizes, this is a population change map over the past 30 years. It summarizes the maps we saw before. You see, the green color stands for population loss, and the brown color stands for population gain. And again, the deeper color means more intense population change. So it's pretty obvious about the population migration patterns for African Americans. People used to live in the inside, were moving outward. see the green areas in the downtown. And the people, or some of the people, used to live in the outside were moving inward. So as a result, in the year 2011, African Americans in the Houston metropolitan area were primarily concentrated in the outer ring, Houston. So that's population distribution. Let's take a look at income. And by the way, all the numbers you see here are real income, means income adjusted for inflation. So that's the arrow in the title. It's actually 1990 to 2011. So just forget about it. So in the 1990, you see all the four groups experienced substantial income growth, especially Asians, of course. And in the 1990s, however, you see the whites and the Asians, their income growth virtually stopped. Well, African Americans had the most substantial income increase in the 1990s. And again, this is what happened in Houston Metro with Harris County and all the surrounding counties. This is not Houston City. Houston City might have a very different story. Okay, poverty. This table basically shows African Americans' representation in the poor population. So all the blue bars stand for African Americans' share in the poor population, while the red bars stand for their share in the general population. So for example, these two bars, this blue bar means in the year 1980, about 36.2%, in all the poor population, about 36.2% were African Americans. Well, in the general population, only 18.1% were African Americans. What does it tell us? It tells us African Americans were highly overrepresented in the poor population in the 1980s. Then 1990, 2000, 2011. See the pattern? African Americans' overrepresentation in the poor population declined significantly and consistently. So in the year 2011, African Americans were almost not overrepresented in the poor population. Again, this is what happened in Houston Metro, not Houston City. Okay, so if African Americans' overrepresentation, their relative share in the poor population declined so significantly, there must be some increase in other racial groups. So what do you think it is? Hispanics? This is the pattern for Hispanics. See, in the year 1980, overrepresented in the poor population. 1990, even more overrepresented. Then in the year 2000, the gap became smaller. In 2011, smaller. So basically, this table tells us not Hispanics. Their overrepresentation in the poor population also declined. Then Asians? No. See, slightly overrepresented in 1980. Then 1990, underrepresented. Even more underrepresented thereafter. So I guess you know which group it is. It's the whites. So in the year 1980, in the poor population, there were about 40% whites. Well, in the general population, whites accounted for like 73%. By the year 2011, the whites' share in the general population declined to 64.6%. Well, they still, their representation in the poor population still remained like 40%. So this is what happened, the whites. Next, let Jennifer present to you the African American poverty rate distribution.
Hi. I'm afraid we can't see a lot of details in these maps, but I'm going to give you a quick run through of the changes, and then the overall changes, and then the incremental changes from year to year. I'm actually not sure how to work this. Okay. So this is the overall change map between 1980 and 2010, although the data were collected in 2011. As you can see, well, let me just explain. The color ranges are poverty went down on the sort of brown or burnt orange end of the scale, and it increased on the blue end of the scale. So you can see there's not really a clear pattern over the period of the changes. You can see a little bit of pockets of extreme change, increase in poverty in certain areas. Unfortunately, the census districts near downtown, or rather in the central Houston area, are quite small because the population is higher there than it actually is per census tract in the outer lying communities. But interestingly, I guess, Fort Bend County had a distinct decline in poverty in these areas. And just on a side note, Fort Bend County, the increase of African Americans living in Fort Bend County was the growth was extremely large between the year 2000 and the year 2010. We talk about that in our demography brief, but our first demography brief, but we're still a little bit unclear as to why. That's something I'd like to talk to people about today. In any case, these areas that have lines through them, there's been basically no change. So if they were bad before in 1980, they were still bad, and if they were fine, then they're still fine. But again, you have a few pockets downtown where poverty decreased, and just sort of an odd assortment. So going back to 1980, oops, oh dear. I'm not sure what I did. Okay, there. Going back to 1980, you can see that there's quite a lot of, okay, and on this map, the lighter end of the scale means that there's less poverty, and the darker end of the scale means that there's more. And again, these were supposed to be like white to burnt orange, for UT and all, but it's a little hard to see that here. Thank you. In any case, out in the sort of immediate suburbs, or rather, I guess in 1980 these weren't immediate suburbs, you have a pretty low rate of poverty. So you've got inner city poverty, and you've got rural, I think what was then rural area poverty. At least that's what I remember from the 80s, the early to mid 80s. So the poverty appears to increase in these, what were then, I think, more rural areas, with the exception of like Galveston. Obviously that's not rural. But again, they also increase in the central city. I have a few more detailed statistics, but I think maybe we'll just save them for the panel. In 2000, again, you have this pattern of sort of a lack of poverty, and I think what was then becoming more common suburbs of Houston. And I think in general there was a movement that I understand came along with the school system integration pattern that went through that period, and that a lot of whites especially left Harris County. But I think in addition, because apparently there was this interpretation that the schools were improving outside of Harris County, people moved towards the edges, near it but not in it anymore, although that's not obviously entirely true. But again, you've got this inner city poverty level. And by the way, the darkest sections are 50% of poverty to 100% poverty, and that's the rate. That's the number. That's 100% means that if of all the African Americans living in these census districts, they are all below poverty line. 50% is 1 in 2. And then in 2011, interestingly, you had a pretty big decrease. As you can see, the light-colored census tracts in number grew. Overall, these, I think, have tended to follow, to some extent, the larger economic patterns in the area, and also major demographic movements, like, again, the one that the school system related one, but also the sort of depression that happened with the fall in oil prices in the late 80s. And I think we might be able to talk about that in more detail during the panel discussion, but you'll see that 1990 was a very bad year for poverty. In any case, I think that kind of concludes what we're going to cover, at least giving you an introduction to the stats. Oh, great! So I can cover a few details. We'll go back to the change map. I'm going to just read through a few statistics that I found kind of remarkable. So in the area, we're using year 2000 census tracts to do comparisons between the years, and there were 886 of them. In 1980, 10 census tracts in Houston or in the Houston metropolitan area, had a poverty level of 75% or above, and 35 were at 50% or above. Among those, 3 of them were at 100%. In 1990, 25 were above 75%, 16 were at 100%, and 102 were at or above 50% poverty. That's 1 in 8 census tracts, essentially. And there, only 10 of those, though, were in poverty at or above 50% in 1980. In 2000, 18 were above 75%, 7 were at 100% among those, and 58 were at above 50%, 25 of those being at or above 50% in 1990. So you actually had a decrease. Thank you. Can I just cover one more real quick? In 2011, the numbers actually fell to 6 census tracts at 100% poverty, 32 at 75 or above, and unfortunately 98 were again at 50% or above. So anyway, I thought that you might be interested in the sort of stark reality of that. And again, those are just at 50% poverty or above. That doesn't even count what in this case is perceived as lower rates of poverty, but still quite high. So we have a lot more to tell you, but we're not going to cover it in the introduction here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wren and Alexander. Our final speaker on this panel is longtime friend, colleague, and fellow sociologist, Professor Joe Fagan, who is a professor, distinguished professor at Texas A&M University. And I welcome Dr. Fagan. Nice to see you. You made it through the traffic, right? Come on up. I don't think he has a problem.
No, I just have my notes. Let me also introduce one of my top graduate students, Glenn Bracey, who's co-author on this paper and is going to take the last bit of what we want to say today. Our paper goes into great detail on a lot of the problems facing black Houstonians today, and given the time that we have, what I would like to say is what our perspective is, what our overall point of view is. I've been studying Houston now for about 73 years. I first moved here in 1940. My parents moved me here in 1940. I graduated from Lamar High School in 1956. So I've been watching Houston a long time. I also wrote a book on Houston, as Bob knows, Free Enterprise City. And Houston's white elite has long celebrated the free enterprise city, the free market, and freedom, and has propagated this mythological imagery for the city, this celebratory imagery of the city, now for many decades. And even now it's added a bit of diversity celebration in its fictional accounts of Houston. But the actual Houston reality is something dramatically different from what is celebrated by the white elite historically. Houston starts in the 1830s as a slavery city. You don't hear much about that in the celebration of Houston. By 1860, a third of Houston's citizens were enslaved, about 1,000 African Americans in Houston, and thousands in the surrounding slave plantations. Houston was a commercial slave center. That's where white wealth started being built up, and where the unjust impoverishment of African Americans in Texas and Houston started being created by that white building up of unjust enrichment. The real story of Houston, the hidden story of Houston, is the unjust enrichment of whites and the unjust impoverishment of African Americans. That's the main theme in our paper, and we have plenty of evidence for it if you want to see the details. After slavery, unfortunately, there was a brief period of Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, Houston's slavery system was replaced by a new system, a totalitarian system of Jim Crow segregation. And among all the cities of the South, Houston certainly had one of the most aggressive, enforced Jim Crow systems. People were thrown in jail for drinking out of white water fountains. The schools were extremely segregated and impoverished. Again, over that period, whites improved on the average the wealth and assets of their families, while black Americans, because of the extreme oppression of Jim Crow oppression, were largely unable to build up assets and wealth for their families to pass along to the present day. One of my graduate students who just finished, Jennifer Mueller, did a remarkable analysis of Texas families and how they pass wealth along over the generations. Some of her families were from this area. She looked at Texas families, white families, and families of color over the last several generations. White families have been able to pass about 6 times as much monetary wealth over their generations, compared to families of color, which have been able to pass along about 1/6, much less wealth. The wealth takes the form of money passed from one generation to the next, houses passed from one generation to the next, land passed from one generation to the next. White Texas families have been able to pass along far greater wealth and assets to the present day because of this long history of Jim Crow and slavery. 2/3 of Houston's history, 2/3 of Houston's history is slavery and Jim Crow. You don't get rid of the effects of slavery and Jim Crow in 40 years, when it starts in the 1840s and 30s. Mueller's research also shows not only did the white families benefit from this passing along of far greater wealth, houses and monetary wealth, over this period. But these white families, our white families, my family, historically got tremendous affirmative action benefits for white Americans. Now, somehow in the discussions at the Supreme Court, there seems to be a notion that the affirmative action is something that's primarily benefited folks of color. I've got a news for the Supreme Court. About, 100,000 times, and I'm not exaggerating, about 100,000 times the amount of affirmative action has been given to whites historically, in the form of the Homestead Acts, which gave away enormous amounts of land to white families, including some of my relatives in East Texas historically. Because of Jim Crow, black families were almost entirely excluded from the federal land giveaways. We whites also benefited from veterans programs and housing programs after World War II. Largely, black Houstonians and black Texans were largely excluded from those programs. So enormous amounts of wealth have been passed across white generations to white Houstonians, white Texans, white Americans, at the same time that black Americans were unjustly impoverished by slavery first, then Jim Crow, and now contemporary racial discrimination. In the paper, we developed discussions of 3 areas where it's easy to demonstrate continuing racial inequality in Houston and how it's rooted in this past history of unjust enrichment and unjust impoverishment. We examined continuing police brutality and police malpractice in Houston. We examined the patterns of residential segregation. Houston's still the most segregated city in Texas, big city in Texas, even though it's improving slowly. It's still one of the most segregated cities in the country, as segregated, for example, as Los Angeles. So Houston has these fundamental problems of great wealth inequality, great economic and income equality in Houston today. These realities of inequality, unjust enrichment for whites, unjust impoverishment for blacks, and some other people of color, are rooted very deeply in this history of slavery, Jim Crow, and large-scale affirmative action programs for whites in the form of things like the Homestead Acts, federal programs aimed at white Americans, and the like. Like other black Americans, black Houstonians regularly experience James Crow Jr. racism. Another one of my graduate students recently interviewed black pilots in Texas and the Southwest, and she was asking one of the pilots what he faced in terms of discrimination today, and he said, well, you know, I face racial discrimination. It's not quite like Jim Crow, but it's sneaky, it's concealed. It's often hidden under a pretty face. He says, you know, it's kind of James Crow Jr. racism. And I think he's right. The face of Houston is increasingly, particularly by the elite, prettified, rosy, celebratory still, but just below that surface is still this long history of unjust enrichment and unjust impoverishment. Now Glenn's going to pick up from there, maybe on possible solutions.
Like Joe, I've been studying Houston for 73 years. No, I've been studying Houston for since about 2006 when I came to Texas A&M, and I have to say, A, I appreciate Joe as a mentor, but B, one of his books about Houston, his book about Houston, Free Enterprise City, is excellent, and yet the language around Houston, I have to say, as a black man who is not a native Texan, is infuriating. because there's so much discussion of Houston as free enterprise, so much discussion of Texas as the Texas miracle, so much discussion of Houston as the place where when America has ups and downs, Houston has managed to float by and do better than the rest of the country, and it holds itself up as an excellent example. And then I look and I say, free enterprise? When was it ever free? When we think about and take seriously the things that Dr. Fagan just laid out, and the things that people will talk about today in terms of the empirical realities of Houston and the racial inequality, we have to recognize that that rhetoric, to the extent that it was ever true, was only true for whites, right? And that rhetoric, if we stopped to really think about what we're doing here today in terms of our own discussion and in terms of our own research, when we talk about the racial inequalities in Houston, what we're implicitly doing is comparing the white life outcomes on health, on residence, on income, etc., to people of color's life outcomes. And that's how we're demonstrating inequality. And on some level, that's what you have to do for empiricism, because you have to deal with the reality that's out there. But we know better, because if we really believe in the possibilities and the talents of people of color, and if we take seriously that unjust enrichment and unjust impoverishment that's been happening since the 1830s and 1840s has robbed all of our ancestors of the real possibilities of contributing their talents and contributing their resources to Houston, then what could actually be is not the lives that whites are living right now. What could actually be, and what should be always our implicit measure, is not the reality that we see, but what we can imagine would have been if all of our ancestors could have contributed really their talents and resources. If Houston really had been a free enterprise city. So it's difficult because we are scientists and we're stuck to the empiricism, but I encourage you all to today and perpetually keep in mind and keep as your implicit measure, what if there was not white racism? How might Houston be different? And if you believe in our actual talents, like I say, then all the things that whites have been able to do over the last 100 and some odd years in Houston would be multiplied 10, 20, 100-fold. That's the reality. So with that vision in mind, we have to account for all the things that we talked about. What can we do, right? Beyond imagining what could be, what else can we do? Well, lots of people in Houston have taken up that challenge, and they have formed major coalitions. There are coalitions around housing revitalization, especially in the Fifth Ward. There are coalitions around black imagery, and there's film, and all these things going on to encourage the city to move forward. One of the coalitions that I have studied in particular is the SEIU, which has organized janitors here in Houston. If you know that was a major fight in 2006, another major fight in 2012. In both cases they had to strike, and in both cases what's important is they were able to address some of the things that we talked about, some of this inequality, by looking at how it actually forms and forming major, large, multiracial, multi-institutional coalitions that were able to attack the problem. Because it's about more than just income. As Joe pointed out, the racism is systemic, it is institutionalized, and so our reactions have to be both systemic and institutionalized. So what the union was able to do was get a contract, 2 contracts now, that gave health care to the workers, 5,000 janitors plus in Houston, and we're able to raise the wages from $20 a day in 2005 up to $9.35 an hour now. It's a very impressive and meaningful change in people's lives, and it moves toward the thing that we are emphasizing. That is the history of asset building. So the income increase and the resistance to things like the government giveaways, like Joe's talking about, where people come in and just take over black communities, build roads in the middle of black communities. That doesn't just disturb the community, that also robs us of our assets that we could pass on to our children, right? So these types of redistribution efforts, like we saw in the union, like we see in other coalitions, give us an opportunity to begin rebuilding our communities, rebuilding our assets, and those are the kinds of opportunities and coalitions we need to build and take advantage of. On a larger level, I want to be true to the ideals and the goals that I laid out myself, and say let's be about both the empirical reality and about what should be in our imaginations. And we know that if the problem is assets and systemic inequality and institutional racism, then we need very large-scale, long-term corrections. And even though it's politically difficult, Joe and I would both advocate for true reparations. Because the wealth that was built, we know empirically, through slavery and Jim Crow, as Joe laid out. 2/3 of Houston's history is slavery and Jim Crow, and now it's Jim Crow Jr. Esquire, right? So we need a counterbalance to that. Reparations would be the only reasonable and just counterbalance to that. We can do that in the form of direct transfers, but that's unlikely. There are lots of plans laid out. Yeah, I know. That was my biggest understatement. But things that we can advocate for in a meaningful fashion. We can advocate for large government programs that move assets from communities where there's unjust enrichment, namely white communities, to communities of color to equate for that unjust impoverishment that's been happening on a large scale, and that demonstrate a faith in communities of color to know what our needs are, to use those funds and opportunities in ways that benefit us, and to build our assets over time in a way that can equal out the problem and bring about the justice that we claim that we have. So thank you for your time, and Joe and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we take a seat. We'll bring a couple more chairs up. Could all the panelists, speakers, presenters, I'm sorry, come to the podium?
It's good to see you.
At this point now we have Q&A, and for those individuals that may have questions, you may come to the mic. We have 2 sets of mics on the in the audience, and as the moderator, I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative and start off with one question. In looking at Houston, the city of Houston, and changes over the last 30 years, and looking at the Houston metropolitan area and those changes that have taken place over the last 30 years, and seeing the some parallels and divergence, what do you see as some of the major strengths in those demographic changes and some of the potential drawbacks from having populations dispersed and poverty dispersed and other kinds of issues dispersed from city to suburbs? Anybody who wants to start, you can come to the mic, take the mic.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start, and I'll say that I think the population changes in Houston give an excellent opportunity for the large multiracial political coalitions that I've been talking about. The unions have targeted Houston in particular because it's a place where things that people say are impossible, like organizing immigrants, organizing blacks and Latinos together, are actually possible. We are shoulder to shoulder. We're working in a very high inequality situation where we're all together in the lower rungs. So that provides us an opportunity to have similar interests, to demonstrate those similar interests, and actually organize in a meaningful way. One of the other huge assets that, in terms of coalition building, Houston has is a history of black politicians in particular. Black politicians in Houston and around the country have demonstrated a stronger predilection for stepping out, putting their necks on the line, and advocating for people of color, especially low-income people of color. And Houston has very strong black and Latino leaders over the last 30 years who've been doing exactly that. So there are promising aspects for the things that we need to do.
I was going to just add to that I think that's the great potential now, with the surging growth of Latinos facing very similar challenges to African Americans, to build those coalitions. And I worry about some of the antagonisms that develop. There are areas where Latinos and African Americans have somewhat different agendas, but overwhelmingly the common interest in opportunity, in education, in access to health care, the great opportunity now. We're no longer a biracial world, we're a multi-ethnic world where the majority of folks, growing majority, are the ones that have been disenfranchised by this history that we've all heard about. This is a great opportunity, it seems to me, in the next period of years to form those coalitions, to bury some of our anxieties about each other, and to build truly powerful coalitions of poor folk, arguing for some redistribution and equity.
Yes.
I was just going to make a note about that too. I grew up in Austin, moved there in 1977, so I actually lived in Texas this whole time that we've been talking about. But I don't know whether this is actually helpful, but I would like to look at it as possibly being the decline in working middle and even upper middle class incomes over the past decade especially, perhaps have helped to give the white population a better frame of reference. And as a woman in the white population, I've always had a lower income than men in equitable areas. And so I've had a little bit of that perspective for a while. It seems to me that gives you a great sort of, it presents a sort of equalizing force, because if we're all low-income people, which at the moment I think we really are, because I'm a student and he's a postdoc. So anyway, in any case, I hope, even though that is obviously not a beneficial thing for any of us, perhaps on the reverse side, it helps to unify us in some way.
Have the speaker question?
I have a question about this issue of coalitions and political alliances, but I have two kind of factual background statements sort of to put in as a addition. So there are two professors who are working independently. One's named Walter Burnham and another guy named Kevin Phillips, who talked about these critical realigning elections. Said that the United States was a two-party system ever since it was founded, but that the parties have changed over time at certain periods of 30 to 40 years, 20 to 40 years. And I've been waiting for a change for a while, because the Republican coalition, the so-called Southern State or Sunshine State Coalition, was basically in power at the federal level from 1968 to 2008. two exceptions, with Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. But we've seen this pattern of enrichment go through clearly through the Clinton years and now through the current president, and it hasn't changed. But there do seem to be political changes, and maybe this president represents a change, but...
Okay, get to your question.
Yeah, my question is this. African Americans support the Democratic Party. Is there any feeling about, within this group, both the panelists and the audience, that we really need to move away from the Democratic Party to a different kind of coalition if we're going to get any progress? That's my question.
Anybody want to take a shot at that? We'll get the mic working. Okay.
I think clearly that given the depth of the inequality, the racial inequalities, and the pervasiveness of racist discrimination today, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of white Americans still think out of a very racist white framing of society, with a thin veneer of why can't we all get along? Color blindness. But, you know, we have Brittany Slayton, Professor Slayton over here, who just did a study of white males' views of black women. You don't want to read what she found. You do it anonymously on the web, and we white men will rave in extremely racist terms a great deal of the time. So we have a huge white problem. The problem of race in America is the white problem. The problem of Black Houston, in one sense, is this history of white oppression and reorienting the white population toward ideas of reparation and change. We need another massive civil rights movement, human rights movement. You know, it's even got to go, I think, Fred, beyond political movements. Until we have a massive movement for justice and equality, which this country has claimed for 400 years, right? These deep racial inequalities will just perpetuate themselves.
If I could add one note, if I could add just one note about coalitions, that's my major focus. I would say, if you'll notice, the way that I talked about coalitions, I did not talk about politics as the end goal of those coalitions, right? That there's, and if we just look at the news, we might notice how the Democratic Party does get a lot of support from African Americans. But when you look at the work that African Americans are doing, we're doing work that is extra political, that's also within the political arena. And when we're doing this work, we think of politicians and the Democratic Party as a tool and not an end in and of itself, right? So I think that that's a healthy way to look at politics, look at government, look at institutions.
Maybe I just one quick thought here is the growing inequalities are affecting white Americans as much as they are African Americans. There's a growing underclass of whites that have lost the jobs that used to be here in the blue collar world and are not able to get back into this new global knowledge based economy. So there are opportunities for coalition there too. And it's taken 30 years, but Obamacare is the first serious effort to address the growing inequalities across the board. And it seems to me that there are opportunities here. It's a division not so much by ethnicity, as I say, as it is by class and by access to the avenues that allow people to move forward in a rigidity, an increasingly rigid occupational structure. There's more inequality in America than there is in any industrial country in the world. There is less chance that a poor person in the United States, starting out poor, will make it into the middle class than a poor person in Europe. All of that sense of what it means to be American is up for grabs. And it seems to me there are opportunities for new kinds of coalitions to rebuild the America that the vast majority of Americans believe in.
Can I add something really quickly? I think building on what the other speakers said, but in addition, adding a little piece of information, the economic changes that seem to have been carried on actually started, I believe, with Nixon, but were carried out very strongly with Reagan, both Republicans, but and the economic impacts of those seem to be so strong that those with extreme amounts of money have the power in this country outside of the political system, so the political system in some ways doesn't matter. But turning it again back towards the local and working outside of the political system, it seems that a lot of the progress, at least in the past, I think 5 years, and sadly taking the locavore movement as an example, I wish we had more than that.
No.
But at least in Austin, that's been a method for overcoming food deserts. So you have a direct impact on people's lives that's completely independent from the political system, and that's probably where the progress needs to be made.
Already was partly answered by Dr. Kleinberg, but I have two issues on the table, it seems to me. One is racial injustice, and the other one is the economic injustice or the class difference. And so we've talked about coalitions. Sometimes when we're talking about it, it seems to be coalitions of color, people of color who are experiencing racial injustice. But we have a new reality which you all just talked to, and that is this big injustice that the whites, people like me, are also experiencing. It's nowhere in the same realm. But I'm just wondering if you have any more to say, any more ideas about, number one, whether white folks can be part of these coalitions in an understanding way, and two, how can we, or number two would be, does the economic injustice that more people are beginning to experience give us a vehicle to join in coalitions? I don't know if they're on the same level or should be considered as such, but I'm wondering. Back to you all.
Yeah.
Unfortunately not.
Still taking a hard line.
I think Dr. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, once pointed out that we whites got the public and psychological wage of whiteness in return for not joining coalitions that would improve everybody's economic benefits. And the empirical evidence for that right now is the bedrock foundation of the Republican Party are working class, lower middle class white Americans. The Tea Party, almost entirely working class, lower middle class whites. So again, until we can change, re-educate whites, change whites' views, get them to see that they got material wealth unjustly, that we got wealth unjustly, and deal with that gross fundamental injustice, the only coalitions you can pull whites into will be small numbers of whites who are willing to recognize the racist history of the country, the racist history of our own families and lives, and willing to give up that in order to join coalitions. Most whites are not prepared. Most of us accept these celebratory fictions about the society. That we're a colorblind society. Racism is gone. Reverse racism is the problem today. That's what most working class and middle class whites believe.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
I think there's room for a little more optimism. You're talking about the Tea Party. They are overwhelmingly old whites. Young, all of our surveys, I didn't get a chance to show this here, but the same pattern that we find among African Americans, young whites are the most powerful predictor among Anglos in general about attitudes toward ethnic diversity, support for affirmative action even, or is age. Younger Anglos see a different world than older Anglos. They are coming of age in a time of multi-ethnic experience. They are falling in love with each other. They are dating each other. They are building connections and friendships that connect over those periods. So Joe and I have had long histories of Is it half full or half empty? We agree on the data, but my sense is that there's real opportunities today, and it's not a white-black world anymore. It is a multi-ethnic world, and it's a world of increasing inequality, and it's a world where younger folks are much more ready to work together in coalitions, it seems to me, than older folks, and so there is room for some optimism here.
Yeah, it's fairly small. You want to add?
Yeah, let me add. As moderator, I'd like to add 2 cents and chime in with my 2 other fellow sociologists, 3 sociologists. I think I agree with both perspectives. I think, but also add another flavor. I agree with my 2 white colleagues. I think that. And being a black person most of my life, I think a lot of the racism and races are going to have to die off, and we're going to have to put in check the reproduction of young races, white races. So with the combination of the 2, of the old ones dying off and putting in check the reproduction of younger ones, I think there's hope.
Can I make a...
Yes.
Okay. Again, my work is primarily about interracial political coalitions, so I would like to add a couple of things. One, what's important especially is the leadership. The racial makeup of the leadership of these coalitions is essential because whites have a long history of joining these coalitions, taking the leadership, and then moving the coalitions toward white goals and away from people of color's goals. Yeah. And not only away from people of color's goals, but sacrificing people of color's interest to achieve those white goals, right? So if we're doing these coalitions, we have to be sure that at every level, people of color have the power to maintain the direction of the coalition according to what our communities believe is necessary.
Thank you. There's a question up front.
Yes. We don't have the coalition of Mickey Leland and Ben Reyes today. There's no such version of that, okay? The 18th Congressional District, when Lyndon Johnson called Mac Hanna and said, hey, I'm coming to Houston, we're going to announce the first person of color from the South to run for Congress, and he named Barbara Jordan. Mac Hanna called me and said, we're going to throw a party at the Rice. Let's come on over to my office. We're going to put it together. Well, Barbara Jordan had a question often asked her. Why aren't you a member of the Congressional Black Caucus? And Barbara would stop and ponder, and she'd look him straight in the eye and say, I am a member of Congress. Now, most people didn't get that, but she believed in having to work the system from within. Now, the Democratic Party is not our friend. In order for Lyndon to get her to run for Congress, the local Democrats told him to go to hell. They weren't going to create a seat. So we had to give up a seat, and nobody talks about that. Her Senate seat disappeared, okay? We had to give up that seat to the Democrats so we could get them to support Barbara for Congress. That's totally out the rhetoric. Mm-hmm. Now, the 18th Congressional District used to stop at OST. Now it meanders out way past there, past Reed Road. All of those changes in the map that you showed and the changes that Stephen Kleinberg talks about, the 18th, all of our black city council districts, our Senate seats, our state rep seats, they are disappearing because of this new inner growth of Hispanics and Asians and whites in the 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, all of our inner cities. Jarvis Johnson says all the blacks are running to the lands, the sugar lands, the Pearlands, the woodlands. That's where they run into, okay? But part of your thing where they created these new Jim Crow laws, one of the laws that was created was about the new housing, subsidized housing. They said, we're not going to fund housing that's over 4 years old. So that meant all the blacks in 3rd Ward who owned apartment complexes. And one day I was riding out at Fondren Southwest and I saw this woman in these big fuzzy house shoes going down the street with all her kids. I said, where these Negroes come from way out here? And they were there because wealthy white builders could build subsidized housing in the suburbs, whereas we couldn't even build it ourselves and repair our own houses in the inner city to make business. They took it from us and moved all the poor people to the suburbs. That's how they got out there. And then on your map, remember you show they start disappearing? They didn't disappear. They were still there, just more wealthy blacks moved to the suburbs to get away from the inner city. You know, so my question to you is, how can we sensitize our black elected officials to get back focused to doing what they need to do and build these coalitions? We can't build them. It has to be a Symphonia Thompson and a Jessica Farrar. You know, it has to be, they have to initiate that. We can't put them together and make it happen. But from your standpoint, you have a catalytic agent here, Texas Southern University. I applaud what they've done today. A couple of weeks ago, they had a forum on police brutality. But we need to get the word out and spread it more and tell people what you all are trying to do. So my question is, what else needs to be done to infect the whole community with what's here today?
Thank you. Right, thank you.
Yeah, you've asked the right questions. Super comments too. It's clear that Professor Bullard and others here really ought to be having sessions like this every day almost, right? And inviting these political officials in, right? To talk about these things, to engage these things about how do you organize for change? How do you start bringing change to Houston? How do you organize? You've just got to constantly hammer it so it gets in the newspapers. So it's talked about, and it's not just an occasional forum, right, or colloquium like this. Because racism was built, it took it 400 years, right? We've had 400 years of racial oppression in this country. And you don't undo that in a few years. You've got to build on it day by day by day, I think. And you've got to bring those politicians in. You're absolutely right.
Let me just say I disagree slightly. And first of all, let me thank you for your long work politically and for the community. And I really appreciate you bringing that history of the Senate seat being taken by the Democratic Party, all of that stuff. I don't think we take the time to really learn that history enough, so I appreciate it. Let me disagree just a little bit in saying that I don't think that we should wait for our political leaders to organize the coalitions. I do believe that everyday working class people organize most effectively and are more in tune with the things that we actually need than most of our elected officials. I don't think there's any reason to wait. And I think that politicians come once the party started. You know what I mean? So we have to start the party ourselves.
Okay, let's take a question in the back.
We had an all-star here, and I really feel like this is the all-stars. I mean, Dr. Kleinberg, Dr. Fagan wrote Racist America, took on sociology. I taught out of that book at the University of Pittsburgh. I teach out of it here. Dr. Bullard. I mean, this is the all-stars. If there ever was all-stars, you guys are the all-stars, and I feel giddy to be in the room with you. I really, really do. And I want to, my question comes up around housing, because right now we have a critical issue in the housing community. I'm the vice chair of the Houston Housing Authority, and there's something that's called fair housing that is being used as a tool against urban communities. Right now we're trying to bring investment into Southeast Houston, a grocery store at 288 in Airport, a grocery store at Belford and Cullen, and the fair housing advocates who are supposed to be advocating are telling us that it is improper and illegal for us to bring development and revitalization into minority communities because it does not meet the mix for racial. And I keep saying we can't wait for people to come in and take our community. We've got to invest in our community to make our community viable. It's not our fault nobody wants to live with us. That's not until we leave. That's not our fault. Don't penalize us. But we really need scholars to be on the front line because these individuals have put legal cases up against us. We have dollars that are waiting to come down with the Disaster 2 money, but we are being blocked by people who say they know what's best for us. And we really need to take on this housing issue, because until we invest in the move to opportunity was a big experiment, and it has shown that moving people to other communities for opportunity is not possible because they're structurally not permissible to mobility. And so I really want to hear, how are we going to take up that issue? And then I want to finally give credence to this. TOP is organizing across racial groups, Working for America, which is taking on wage theft. So it is happening, and the community, I'll say this, Ella Baker said, strong people don't need strong leaders. Strong people don't need strong leaders. And so it really is going to be the community that's going to put political people on notice about what we want and what we need. And it's happening in this city.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much. Could I just interject? Panel 4 this afternoon, there's a session that deals with housing, fair housing, and residential patterns, etc. But we can also deal with it here. Might want to take a shot?
Well, it's hard to top that. She said it well, I think.
She did.
Amen. Yeah, the principle in American history that works is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And the only time we've had major racial change in this country is when black folks organized and raised hell.
Yeah.
You know, in the abolitionists and the Civil War era, the 200,000 black soldiers who won the war for Mr. Lincoln, and the black civil rights movements have been the time we got real change. You're going to have movements of people in the streets, I think, protesting that kind of, using diversity against racial change, right? Yeah. Diversity is the new con, right? Diversity, right? You put what? One woman in a group of white men, and that's diversity, right? Yeah, and it kind of trumps black issues and racism issues, I think. So I think it takes organization, people in the streets.
Okay.
I was going to...
Oh, sorry. We have a...
I was going to respond to the last question, but yours also provides an opportunity for this. We had the great privilege last week, or perhaps the week before, of hearing former Mayor Shirley Franklin from Atlanta speak, and on the one hand, a few things that she said were kind of disappointing from my perspective as a woman, because she essentially said she had to give in to the stereotypical beliefs of the people she was going to be working with and to appeal to in order to get voted, and that she also had to make changes within the system, but she, I guess, creatively and administratively came up with solutions that would achieve the end goal without overtly carrying a race-based mask. Mask is probably not the wrong word, or probably is the wrong word, but she would get change made for the African American community without containing it in packages that labeled it as such. So I don't know whether that really does provide a tool, and it kind of goes in the face of what Dr. Fagan was saying, and not intentionally, but just from an administrator's point of view, that was one of the things that she very strongly recommended. And she didn't outright say, minimize the racial or ethnic labels on the proposals, but that if you overtly put that out there, you get resistance from the old guard instead of getting what you want done.
Okay, we're going to have our final question from the gentleman in the back.
First of all, I want to thank the Barbara Jordan, Mickey Lehman School of Public Affairs for this. It's not working. It's not working. Oh, it is. Again, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment on how each one of your presentations complement each other, because the quantitative data that was presented by Dr. Kleinberg and then by Alexander and Hen because when I was looking and taking notes after Dr. Kleinberg's presentation, I saw that the demographics, spoke to particular things, but they were more things quantitatively. It was hard for me to qualitatively come to some conclusions because you were focusing on Houston. But then when the Alexander and Hen came in and brought the metropolitan area in, I was able to see the dynamics of power and suburbanization and the concentration of wealth and class and those aspects. So it's good that all of those perspectives come in, because one without the other, this mic is having some problems. One without the other, it kind of, the analysis is less qualified. And I just wanted to ask you some questions, Dr. Kleinberg, on some things that you were talking about. Your concept of, you used the word peoplehood a couple of times when you were analyzing the opinions and the attitudes that you got from your research. And I'm trying to translate that peoplehood into power, because you said you did the study over 30 years. Wouldn't you characterize those things as issues of like maybe attitudes or beliefs as opposed to a concept of peoplehood? Because peoplehood would have translated into more institutional presence in the communities and more, I guess you can say, a form of resistance and insistence on a change in the power relations.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to find the right word for what is a striking phenomenon, that among African Americans, unlike Latinos or Anglos, as African Americans move up in the socioeconomic status and get more education and move into the middle class, they retain this very deep sense of connection to poor African Americans, that wealthier Anglos feel no connection to poor Anglos, wealthier Latinos feel very little connection to poor Latinos. So I was trying to get some sense of what makes that happen, and I think it's this feeling of that experience of having been oppressed for so many years, that even when and I think middle class African Americans have a sort of a hold on the middle class, but it's always a tentative hold. It's always a sense that there, but for the grace of God go I, kind of thing. So that it's a source of, I think, tremendous power in the African American community, that they don't lose the allegiance of that as African Americans move into the middle class, they don't move away from a sense of connection to the wider community. And so peoplehood was sort of one word that might help, but I'd be happy to think of other terms if you have them. But it's a remarkable quality that African Americans show in a way that, as I say, Latinos and Anglos don't, which I think is important. Thank you.
I wish they would move back to the neighborhood.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to bring this to a closure, and let's give the panelists as well as the audience a round of applause. Thank you very much. We're going to go now into a 10-minute break, and we'll be back in for panel 2 promptly at 10:40. So let's get your coffee, tea,